I asked Brad Cole for a slide. That it's quite a picture, of course, to see. And now one of the people in the picture is no more, because Osama bin Laden was killed less than a week ago, and I'm not going to comment on that, because I'll reserve those comments to the other topic, the cosmic conflict and the future of America. But it just occurred to me that you have a striking, this was quite a striking idea, and if it is true that God is reaching out to everybody, how does He do it? How does He do it, and how do we, supposedly representing God, how do we reach out? How do we do conflict resolution? And it doesn't follow that everyone whose feet have been washed by Jesus becomes a follower of Jesus. But it does seem to be a policy on the part of Jesus to wash people's feet, including the feet of His enemies, and even known enemies, even those who are plotting against Him. And it is known to Him that they're plotting against Him. He seems to be doing strange things. So it is not entirely irrelevant to put Jesus sort of in the face of world leaders and see how does he speak to the world. And this, of course, the text in John 13 is a text where Jesus, knowing where He came from, knowing where He was going, He takes off His coat and puts on His towel. That is a sort of, there is a consciousness of power on the part of Jesus, and this is what He does next then. So that might be something to return to. Obama's approval ratings in the poll have gone up across the board. In the New York Times, there is a list of all the voter groups, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, all have, he has had a bounce in the opinion polls. The biggest bounce is among evangelical Christians. The evangelical Christians, his approval rating was 30% before Osama bin Laden was killed, and it went up to 50%. So there was a 20% bounce in the opinion polls among evangelicals. The cosmic conflict, I want to introduce this topic on a little bit of a personal note, because when I came to St. Andrews, University of St. Andrews, to do my work on the book of Revelation, I've told you this before, that my advisors, my professors, were not very enthusiastic about someone wanting to do it on Revelation on the cosmic conflict, because the tendency among scholars is to read Revelation more as a political commentary, or as a critique of the Roman Empire and political realities contemporary to the author. And what about Satan? What about this background? That has kind of receded. It does not carry much prestige in the scholarly community. So I thought that was really difficult, because if my advisors do not see any light in me doing this topic, what should I do? If they do not find it persuasive, if they don't find it even relevant to contemporary issues, what shall I do? And I was just groping about. One of my advisors, who is now the dean of theology at Baylor University, at their school of theology there, he's a lovely person, and he was giving me some sort of cosmic conflict sources that he thought, well, at least would appease me somewhat, would sort of put me at ease that I could go that route. There is a person by the name of Walter Wink, who has Walter Wink, two W's. He has written a series of books on confronting the powers. His concept is the powers, and he's written 3 or 4 books on the powers, identifying the powers, and so on, where he almost personifies evil. but he doesn't quite do it. He doesn't. There is no person at the end of the story. There is more a sort of evil as a what should I say? It is a composite of structural problems in the world that amounts to evil that is hard to understand. So he was giving me that, and he was a little disappointed, I think, that I did not get, that I did not say, well, that's it, that's what I'll do, because I said, there is a person there. It's personified from the ground up. So in my reading, there is another person who has written a book, Elaine Pagels. I have mentioned her before here. Pagels, she has written many books. One of her books is The Origin of Satan, is one of her titles. And she's a very learned scholar. She's she's the foremost expert on the Gnostic Gospels, the Gospel of Thomas, the Nag Hammadi finds in Egypt. That is probably the second most important archaeological discovery next to the Dead Sea Scrolls. And she has written on sort of ideas about evil, the origin of Satan. And she has some insights in that book, but what was valuable most to me is that she referred quite at length in that book to the early Christian church apologist Origen. And I will mention him a little and say a little bit more about him. Because in one of Origen's books, a book called Contra Celsum, against Celsus, Origen, as an early voice in Christianity, he lays out a cosmic conflict theology, a cosmic conflict story that I had never heard of. I was just amazed. I just couldn't believe it. I kept reading these pages in Elaine Pagels' book because she quotes at length from Contra Celsum, and then this led me to look into this, and I spent 6 months almost exclusively reading Origen, and then I wrote it up as best I could, and I intended it to be a chapter in my dissertation. But there is a word limit on dissertations in the UK. So I quickly understood that it would probably, if I were going to do serious exegesis of Revelation, I would have to sacrifice all that hard work that I really would have. It would have made my dissertation or my book more interesting, I think. But anyway, I've published a little on it. The good consequence of that is that when I turned that into my advisors, it was sort of a wake-up call to them, because they didn't know either. They did not know that the early church took the cosmic conflict theme seriously, any more than I had known it. Because what did I think? I thought that the cosmic conflict theology, from my Adventist background, was pretty much something that that Christians owed to maybe John Milton to some extent, and maybe Ellen G. White. Certainly in Adventism, Ellen G. White's name would be inseparable from cosmic conflict perspective. So this was just an amazing discovery for me. And when I published it in Andrews University Seminary Studies, I discovered that hardly anyone in the Adventist scholarly community seemed to know either. They just seemed to not have gone there and explored this. Now there is a reason for that. And the reason for that is that Origen, he lived from about, these are his dates, this is AD. That Origen, from an Adventist point of view, is a mixed blessing, because he did not agree with the Sabbath. The way he sets up the Sabbath is quite bad and doesn't reflect well on him, because his argument is a very poor argument. And then he is also very much influenced by the anthropology of Plato. So Plato, of course, believed in soul and body dualism. And Origen is very much influenced by Platonic thought, because he lived in which city? What is Origen's city? He lived in the Boston of his age. The Boston, then I think about Harvard and MIT. I think about it as the educational capital of that world. And the educational capital of that time was which city? It was Alexandria in Egypt. You know, Alexandria in Egypt for a couple of 100 years before the time of Jesus, and for a couple of 100 years after. For 300-400 years, Alexandria is the go-to place. If you really want to get, you know, a prestigious degree, you go to Alexandria. And this is where Origen had grew up. And so Plato, of course, did not live in Alexandria, but I will just sort of justify the skepticism toward Origen to some extent. Here is Plato, and he dies about 350 BC. And then the way Plato transmits his influence to Christians is partly because of the Hellenistic environment. You know, that you live in a world, you live in a Hellenistic world, you live in a world. What sort of world do we live in today? We live in an Americanized world. We feel the influence of America everywhere. You go to Tibet, you go to Afghanistan, not just because there is war in Afghanistan. You go to Norway, you eat in McDonald's, you wear blue jeans, you know, you listen, you watch American movies. You know, we live in an Americanized world where you cannot escape American culture. If you stood on your head, you just can't get away from it. And that's how it was in the Hellenized world too. You couldn't get away from Hellenistic influences. And Plato was part of that influence, and he transmitted his ideas into Christian thinking through a Jewish thinker in Alexandria by the name of Philo. Philo's dates are similar to the dates of Jesus and the Apostle Paul. But Philo did not know Jesus. He did not know the Apostle Paul, and they, vice versa, they did not know of each other. But Philo is a Jewish intellectual in the city of Alexandria who is thoroughly influenced by Plato's anthropological dualism, that there is soul and body, that we are divided in two pieces. So Philo believes in the immortality of the soul. Origen also believes in the immortality of the soul, and does it in a big way. He is the most dualistic of all the church apologists. And Adventists hold such a grudge against Origen for that reason, that it doesn't matter what else he could say. You know, what little I heard of Origen in my education was all negative. And I did not even bother to go and read it, despite the fact that Origen actually, you know, yes, so he is wrong on this, on his anthropology, if you hear what I'm trying to say, but he has a view of the cosmic conflict where he endeavors to be a Christian. He endeavors to be a Christian in his anthropology too. He just doesn't understand it. He just can't see it because the worldview, the conceptual framework, the way people think in his days, you really can hardly escape thinking that there is soul and body, and the soul outlives the body, and so on. So Origen is the person that I will highlight a little here and show just some excerpts from his cosmic conflict thinking. The occasion for Origen writing on this subject is like this. In the late 2nd century, a person by the name of Celsus, who was not a Christian, who was actually there are various phases of Plato. Plato is the most influential philosopher of all time. In Adventist circles, we don't do much philosophy. but we neglect it to our detriment, probably. So Plato, early on, 300-400 years before the time of Jesus, Plato's teacher was who? Socrates, of course. And then, so there is the early Platonic ideas, then there is Middle Platonism, which is at the time of Jesus, and then there is Neoplatonism, which is our time, and there are many people even today sworn to the ideas of Plato. So it has not gone out of fashion. It never has gone out of fashion, in fact. Celsus had written a book. Celsus, who is in some ways a Platonic philosopher, he had written a book about 175 AD against Christianity. And he writes this book because Christianity is becoming influential, and he wants to show how Christian belief is not worth much. He wants to, it's one of the earliest, probably the earliest attack on Christian belief written by a thinking person in the ancient world. There are other snippets, sort of disparaging comments on Christianity, but this is a book written specifically to counter Christians. And many books like it have been written since that time. This book was published, and then Origen writes his book much later, about 60, 70 years later, when Celsus is dead and buried. So this is not a discussion between two intellectuals that live at the same time. So it's not really a dialogue. You might say Origen talks to Celsus, but Celsus cannot talk back because Celsus is dead by now. And we do not have Celsus's book. I meant to bring these books today, but then something happened and I wasn't able to go and pick them up. What we know of the content of Celsus's book, we know it because Origen quotes him copiously. He reproduces passage after passage after passage of Celsus's book. He says, then Celsus says this, then Celsus says that. He goes on to say this, and he quotes him quite, what should I say, quite, he doesn't demean him. He just quotes him very much sort of matter-of-factly, you might say. And then some scholars have taken all those quotations, all those references to what Celsus said. Some scholars have taken that and excerpted it from Origen's book and put it to try to restore the original text of Celsus's book. So that has been done too, and I have that book, Celsus on the True Doctrine. But, you know, whether that is a complete version of Celsus's book is highly unlikely, as though Origen took Celsus's book and then went through it all the way, you know, and then we have the whole thing. That is probably unlikely. Origen's book is quite a book. And here is a couple more things we should know about Origen. Origen is one of the most prolific Christian writers ever to have lived. He wrote copiously. He was also a textual scholar, a textual critic of sorts. He wrote a book that I know Bernard Taylor in Loma Linda would have died to get hold of that book. He wrote a book called the Hexapla. The Hexapla is an Old Testament in 6 columns, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 columns, with the Hebrew text, a Hebrew transliteration, and then 4 Greek texts, all in parallel columns, in longhand. You know, he produced this amazing book, you know, to show why did he do it? He wanted to have the best possible resource with which Christians could quote the Old Testament and show that Christianity had solid basis in Old Testament scripture. And he wanted to have the best textual resources for that. He was an apologist. He was a defender of the Christian faith. So this enormous project he took on, in addition to writing lots of sermons, lots of books, lots of commentaries, including two major apologetic works, Contra Celsum, against Celsus, and another book called First Principles that he wrote about 20 years earlier, before Contra Celsum. And First Principles also has a lot of Origen's ideas about the cosmic conflict. So the two main books by Origen where you could read about the cosmic conflict is Contra Celsum and the other book on First Principles. Origen remains the most influential thinker in the Eastern Orthodox Church. Greek Orthodox, Serbian Orthodox, Russian Orthodox. Origen is the patron saint and the leading thinker still in Orthodox theology. He took a beating in Roman Catholic thinking. He was very influential in the Catholic Church until about 200 years after his death. People had developed Christology to a point that Christology had not been developed that much in the time of in Origen's days. So I've told some of my students that it is like you and me taking being asked to sit for an exam. Let's say that you did boards, you took boards. I took boards long ago. And then if I were to sit for boards now with no preparations, I would surely fail. Or I would have to update myself. But Origen was asked, the church, the Roman Catholic Church especially, took Origen's writings and tested them and held them to the standard of 200 years later, and then they excommunicated him. He has been rehabilitated since then. Origen is not very influential in Protestant theology because Luther wrote very disparagingly about Origen. And in the other place where I have written about this, I have somewhat faulted Luther for his criticism for not understanding Origen's context. So this is the background then, and I'm going to just do a few excerpts here from what Celsus. Then let's do our timeline. So 175, 244, Celsus, Origen. So first I want to emphasize that what we will hear first is not what Origen believed, but what a non-Christian living much earlier thinks that Christians believe. So you're accessing Christian belief through the eyes of a non-Christian quite early in the 2nd century AD. That's important because we must not attribute to Origen everything we're saying here. Some of the voice we hear first here is the voice of Celsus and not the voice of Origen. So now let's read the first statement. Let's just say that I'll just put it up like this. There is first a descriptive task. What in the eyes of non-Christians do Christians believe in the 2nd century? And then Celsus has a critical project, and he mixes that up. His description and his criticism, they go hand in hand. He doesn't separate them. He doesn't report what they believe and then criticize it. He sort of mashes it up there. You have that criticism of him, and then finally Celsus will say what he believes. You might be impressed or you might not be impressed when his turn comes to show that his beliefs are superior. So maybe one of you could read this statement from Celsus. This is our first thing that relates to cosmic conflict ideas.
Their utter stupidity, the Christians, can be illustrated in any number of ways, but especially with their misreading of the divine enigmas and their insistence that there exists a being opposed to God, whom they know by the name of devil, in Hebrew Satanas, for they refer to one and the same being by various names.
So what is Celsus saying here? Christians are not very intelligent. They are stupid. And then he has to prove, what is it? By their insistence. It's not just like that is a peripheral idea. So Christians are not very intelligent, and the lack of intelligence shows itself in what? That they believe that reality has a triangular shape. There is God, there is divine reality, there is human reality, and there is a non-human reality. By their insistence that there exists a being opposed to God whom they know by the name of devil, and then that's the Greek diabolos, and the Hebrew is Satanas. So what do Christians believe in the second century according to the observer? Well, that's what they believe. They believe that there is a sort of cosmic perspective to good and evil. That's what they believe. That's what he's saying, and he's calling that stupid, because he, as an educated philosopher in the second century, does not believe that. So there is a being opposed to God, and that in terms of what God is up against, what happens in human reality seems to some extent to be less important than what is happening in non-human reality. That being that is opposed to God is not you. It's not me. It is someone who is not a human being. It is a being of a different order. You see that? That is kind of sort of coming on to the subject. Yes. Well, there is a lot of diversity to Greek belief at this time, but educated Greeks at this time, or people who by the second century AD, there is still polytheism. There is still, in many ways rampant polytheism. But among the educated elite, they are not polytheists anymore. There is a sort of rudimentary monotheism even in Socrates. And when he is put on trial hundreds of years before the time of Jesus, one of the charges against him is that he is proclaiming new divinities, that he is changing the pantheon, you might say. So for Celsus, we should not hear him saying he represents a point of view, and that point of view is not necessarily a polytheistic point of view. It is more likely a monotheistic view, and where God is very much the sovereign. God is, yeah, that's at least the notion of a supreme divine being would be more compatible with Celsus's view. Let's go on here. One of you read this one.
But they show how utterly concocted these ideas are when they go on to say that the highest God in heaven, desiring to do such and such, say, confer some great gift on man, cannot fulfill his purpose because he is opposed and thwarted by a God who is his opposite. Does this mean that the Son of God can be beaten by a devil?
Yeah, what is he saying here? What's he saying here? What's the consequence? The consequence of allowing a non-human being here, and if we were to rank these in order of significance, you could put 1 here, and then you would have to put 2 here and 3 here, and say in order of significance it is the non-human reality here that is really creating the trouble, creating the problem. So what is it? Why does he's not exactly flattering how utterly concocted these ideas are, and so on. When they say that the highest God of heaven can't, what is he saying? What sort of God does he understand? A God of power, a God of power. That view, that Christian paradigm leaves a power deficit in God. It takes away from God's dignity too. Let's see, I put a headline on this one that he shows there's a kind of a weak God here from the point of view of a non-Christian. Read this one next.
It is blasphemy to say that when the greatest God indeed wishes to confer some benefit upon men, he has a power which is opposed to him, and so is unable to do it.
So what are we highlighting here? It's more of the same, that he faults Christian theology for its theology. He's saying that Christian theology is a bad theology because it makes God look weak. It makes God look spineless. It takes away from God's dignity, because a God worthy of the name should get his way. He should not have any sort of other concerns than, that there is someone to oppose it, that there is some other consideration that should influence God's doings. That is simply not good theology. That's what we're hearing him say. Then he brings in Jesus. He comes to Jesus and discusses Jesus. Let's read that one. I will not go through all the slides that I put in your handout, because that you can read the statements yourself. Just highlight a few things here and then try to put it in perspective.
But the Christian notion that the Son of God accepted the punishments inflicted upon him by a devil is mere ludicrous, especially if we are to think that this is to teach us to endure punishments quietly. In my view, the Son of God had a right to punish the devil. He certainly had no reason to threaten with punishment the men he came to save, the very ones who had suffered so much from the devil's abuse.
So does Jesus represent an argument or a reality that helps Celsus? So he looks at the Christian paradigm. There is a being opposed to God. That is a problem. Of course, that is a problem for him. That is problem number one, you might say. Well, the Christians Christians will bring in Jesus, and does that make the problem better or worse? Well, Jesus makes the problem even worse. Jesus is no solution, because here he's saying, the Son of God accepted the punishment inflicted upon him by a devil is merely ludicrous. It is unjust. It doesn't make sense. What should he do? I mean, who should put whom in his place? Well, the Son of God, if he represents God, should put the devil in his place. Let's get this right. If you have anything to do with God, you should be able to fix it, And there is again a power paradigm here. So what we are seeing in this discussion, in my view, is not only that the early Christians believe in a cosmic conflict, but that the theology of that understanding, the theological meaning, significance of this view is also quite well developed, quite fully developed here. And so all of these things get put on their head, or on its head, in the Christian view. Jesus then is an ungodlike figure because he submits to suffer abuse by powers that are much less good than he is, as it were. Let's read this one.
It is mere impiousness, therefore, to suggest that the things which were done to Jesus were done to God. Certain things are simply, as a matter of logic, impossible to God, namely, those things which violate the consistency of his nature. God cannot do less than what it befits God to do, what it is God's nature to do. Even if the prophets had foretold such things about the Son of God, it would have been necessary to say, according to the axiom I have cited, that the prophets were wrong, rather than to believe that God has suffered and died.
Okay, what is this axiom? Again, it's more of the same. What is this axiom? It would have been necessary to say according to the axiom I have cited. What is the axiom? That God is sovereign. God is sovereign. God is powerful. There is a certain thing that you can have an idea about God, and whatever you claim to be happening sort of in God's name has to be consistent with God's nature. And here we have a view that violates God's nature. And it violates God's nature specifically in what field? Power deficit. There is this, it screams at you, the power deficit in the Christian story. Something is happening that should not be happening if God, just behaved like God. Meaning, behaving in a sort of power way. So Celsus understands God primarily in a power relation. And that is the big difference. That's the big misunderstanding. And then Origen will answer him in a moment. So, but aren't these amazing statements? There's an amazing critique. You're reading somebody taking stock, taking the pulse of Christianity, and not just, as I said, not just doing it, seeing that there is a triangular shape to the Christian view of reality, but actually spelling out what he finds offensive about that view, and to sort of access that for us in our era does not seem to me to be a waste of time. I was totally blown away by these things when I read this. I just said, what on earth have I done? All these years I was a student in Adventist schools, and nobody told me about this. and everyone, and I was trained to think that this kind of ideas that are so well developed in the writings of Ellen G. White had never before been developed in Christian writings. But that was simply not the case, because here they are. You see them here in these early sources we have in the early church. So I find the idea that there is a personified evil in the world, I find that to have tremendous explanatory power in terms of present reality. Now, let's summarize a few things. Celsus has not misstated the Christian belief. He doesn't like it. He thinks it's bad. But he seems to have represented it fairly well, that they actually believe that. The Christian understanding of evil has a triangular shape, and the non-human side of that triangle is hugely important. That's same point. And the early church then believed in the cosmic conflict. That was a conspicuous and important belief in the early church. Here is Origen. I have taken statements not only from Contra Celsum here, but here is one statement from Origen in First Principles. The name devil and Satan and wicked one is mentioned in many places of Scripture, and he who bears it is also described as being the enemy of God. This is, so he has that belief. Here is a statement from a commentary on Romans. And Romans 5, if you read Romans 5, you will see that there is nothing there that will tip you off to Satan or anything like that. But Origen has this cosmic conflict perspective. It sort of comes into his theology everywhere. So here in a comment on Romans 5:10, or is it Romans 6? I can't remember now. Maybe it is in Romans. It's in Romans 5 or 6 he makes this comment. He who was Lucifer, and who arose in heaven, he who was without sin from the day of his birth, and who was among the cherubim, was able to fall with respect to the kindness of the Son of God before he could be bound by chains of love. You know, what is he giving you here? What's this? This is a shorthand biography. This is the bullet point biography of the cosmic conflict, of the non-human reality in the cosmic conflict. He who was Lucifer, who arose in heaven, who was without sin, who was among the cherubim, was able to fall with respect to the kindness of the Son of God. Now this is a shorthand narrative of the cosmic rebel, and you can hear allusions to various texts in the Old Testament there, can't you? It comes here completely gratuitous in a commentary on Romans 5 or 6. So I have said here that Origen's view has a narratival structure, because Celsus will argue against Origen, against Christian belief as a philosopher. But Origen does not want to argue as a philosopher here. He just merely is telling a story. And sometimes I ask students, what's the difference between narratival and philosophical logic? So I'll ask you that too. Well, that's a great expression, isn't it? Because because being bound by the chains of love is a metaphor for in Origen. Origen does not think that you should ever be bound, because he thinks that a relationship between a human being and God should be a relationship of freedom. So chains of love is in some ways an internally inconsistent expression, because love does not do chains, you know. So chains of love must be the chain of freedom, in a sense. It is an expression that doesn't really, you know, you see what I'm trying to say? It is an internally inconsistent, it's a metaphorical expression. It means that you are bound tightly, but you are bound in freedom. That's what I would say. You're bound, you know, in obligated by something that might seem like chains, but it is the chain of love, as it were. Here, he strives to retain a Christian narrative. He is not, because the Christian idea of Lucifer is not a philosophically grounded idea. It is an idea grounded in what? In revelation. You know, it is a story that has been given to us through revelation, and it is not something that was developed philosophically. I just wanted to do the part on the narrative there. So anyone want to explain the difference between philosophy and narrative? I'll tell you what narratival logic is. The example I use is I ask a student, what did you do this morning? So I'll ask you, Brent, what did you do this morning? You went for a walk? Uh-huh. You got up? Yeah. You got dressed? Uh-huh. And then you went for a walk? Uh-huh. And then did you drive here or you walked here? Uh-huh. Okay. And now you're here. Now why is he telling us this? Why is he telling us? What? Well, this is like a coercive interrogation, you know. He is telling us that because that's what happened. And that's narrative logic. Narrative logic is simple. It tells you what happened. You know, it doesn't say any sort of, you know, you can ask questions. We can ask you why, and you can explain certain things to us. But narrative logic begins with narrative. It does not begin with a philosophical question. Now, does it give rise to questions? Isn't it strange that these things happened? You know, one person, and I think I have quoted him in that handout I sent out, John Hick, he says that that the notion of Lucifer, he's a Christian theologian who deals with good and evil. John Hick says the notion that sin came into the world is completely philosophically a non-viable idea. You could not have perfection and then have sin. Philosophically, that's impossible. So if you have sin, it means that you did not have perfection, which is an important idea to John Hick, who wants to make these things philosophically plausible. Now, by philosophical logic, that seems like a tall order to do that. You have sin, and you said you had perfection. You could not move from perfection to sin, philosophically. But you moved. The story says exactly that. That is what the narrative gives you. You had perfection, and you have sin. That's narrative logic. So how could you have that? Well, you know, the narrative will say you're obligated by the narrative, and the narrative will not take a no from philosophy. It will not be defeated by philosophy. It will hold philosophy to the narrative, to the narratival parameters. The story is like this. Okay, now the sources Origen has are sources familiar to us. The way he argues for the relevance of Isaiah 14 and the relevance of Ezekiel 28, it's priceless. I really recommend it. The way he argues and says, can't you see that this is more than a human phenomenon. And he argues that, and I wish modern theologians who disagree with Origen on this point, I wish they would read it, because Origen has a very excellent argument there. And then he says there are lots of texts there. And those of you, if some of you have not been on our mailing list and would like to receive that background reading I sent out to those who are on the mailing list, please let me know and I will send it to you too. These are, so I'm just going to skip by these now, because because I want to go to I'd like you to do some of this reading on your own. Now quickly to Celsus. When we come to Celsus and Origen discusses what Celsus is saying, how does he explain evil? Well, first of all, he explains it philosophically, and then he says that evil resides in matter, not in choice. There is evil in the world because there is material reality. That's a Platonic idea. So here Celsus is showing his Platonism. And then he says that evil has always existed in the same amount. It's always been there, will always be there, never go away. Evil, does it have a beginning to Celsus? No. Does it have an ending? No. So there is you're kind of stuck. There is a deterministic sort of frame to his texture, to his ideas. History to Celsus is cyclic. It is not linear as in the Christian paradigm. And his outlook is deterministic and very pessimistic. And I say in my critique of Celsus, I say that he goes up with a bang and comes down with a whimper, because he makes you think that he is going to give a very superior explanation. But when he has done it, you are very unimpressed. Most readers of Celsus are very unimpressed by what he brings, in terms of to this discussion. What happened to cosmic conflict theology in the minutes that remain? We have it here in Origen. And then in the next century, we have a big change in the fortunes of Christianity with the conversion of the Emperor Constantine. And so, as to make it necessary for us to think in terms of pre-Constantinian and post-Constantinian Christian theology. The first great theologian or church person after Constantine is Augustine, who was also an African, whose influence is greater than Origen's by far, from our times. It's curious that when people look, in contemporary Christian theology, when people try to say, well, is there a cosmic conflict paradigm in Christianity? There is a philosopher in the U.S. today, one of the most influential philosophers, by the name of Alvin Plantinga. Has any one of you been exposed to Alvin Plantinga? Alvin Plantinga is a great Christian apologist. He's very, very clever. I want to avoid him. He's just very clever. and has many interesting ideas. But when he wants to discuss cosmic conflict perspectives as a theologian, it is quite revealing that he goes to Augustine and not to Origen. Even though in Augustine, the narrative, the cosmic conflict narrative is bleached. The colors are fading. It is not it's not such a strong sort of take it or leave it narrative anymore. It is more a philosophical idea. And here, Origen, in the days before Constantine, Origen represents a Christian community that is persecuted. They are a persecuted minority, and they really need freedom. They need to argue the right to belief, to have their beliefs. They need freedom of conscience. They need so you might say that the political context of Origen and his theology fits very much into that cosmic conflict idea. Now, when Augustine comes in, he says that sin came into the world because there is freedom. Because he also argues from a cosmic conflict perspective. But if you ask Augustine, will you allow me to follow my conscience? What will Augustine say? If you ask Origen, will you allow me to follow my conscience? Origen might say, you are choosing a belief that is a very bad belief, you shouldn't do it. But will he let you do it? Origen will let you do it. He has no choice. His theology gives him no choice, and he has nothing else with which to work. Now, when you come to Augustine, Augustine will say there is sin in the world because there was freedom. But if you ask him, will you let me follow my beliefs, the dictates of my conscience, Augustine will say, for your own good, I will coerce you to change your beliefs. Because Augustine does not really believe in freedom. He doesn't believe in it as a reality in the present. So here is the deal. What happened to cosmic conflict theology? Well, we forgot Origen. He disappeared. We, in many ways, forgot Constantine too. And we are all left with Augustine. And we are left with the sort of worldview, with the sort of context that fits a post-Constantinian world without really knowing how it was before or who they were, those who thought before this time. Cosmic conflict theology looked like this: God, human beings, and a third reality. And then it shrunk, it changed to become like this: only God and human beings mattered. There is a sort of two-dimensional, or the third corner of the triangle was lost. Cosmic conflict theology is very detrimental to any notion of coercion. So I'll give you my paradigms here. Somebody has said, Eric Osborne in Australia has said, theodicy gave way to triumphalism. And he says that, so this is my representation of it. You used to have cosmic conflict theodicy, and then inside of that you had other issues: Trinity, soteriology, Christology, all these other issues, concerns that Christians have. But all of those concerns belonged in the context of a cosmic conflict theology, cosmic conflict theodicy. That framework was left, and what was lost, and what you have left is a smaller picture, a smaller, more detailed picture. You see, here is the big picture, and then you have some details within the bigger picture, but the big picture has been lost. And even in our church, even in Adventism, I think we are still not fully aware of how much that has changed theology, and how things would be different if we had, retraced our steps and tried to recover the lost ground. So, okay, our time is up, and next time Melissa will do more on Milton and cosmic conflict perspectives from Milton.